Welcome, welcome to the final session of the Porter Phelps Huntington Museum Summer Speaker Series. It's been said not to be gathering together in the corn barn, but I'm very grateful for this opportunity to continue to talk and think together about this important place and the various advantages it and the lives lived here provide for thinking about our present. We've held these gatherings virtually because of the risks of the pandemic, so it feels particularly moving and appropriate to end with a presentation about illness in early New England. The vulnerabilities and coping strategies of the past and the present reflect powerfully on each other. We will be recording this session, and already are, so you can view it in the other talks and the other talks from this series at a later time. And you'll find the links for all of them on the museum website. I'll keep the chat open for questions and comments throughout the presentation, and I can read and ask those if we need to, but I hope that you'll bring more voices into this conversation when we open for questions at the end. Ben Mutschler's new book, The Province of Affliction, draws significantly on Elizabeth Porter Phelps' diary and other Phelps family papers, affirming, as all the presentations in this series have done, the extraordinary richness of these collections for telling all sorts of stories about the past of this particular place, of the nation as a whole, and of so many larger historical and social patterns. The Porter Phelps Huntington farmstead that houses this local history museum occupies the homeland of Pecumtuck, Nonotuck, Mohawk, Nipmuc, and Mohican peoples displaced by the arrivals of European families like the Porters, who came to Hadley in the 17th century and built this house in 1752. The museum recognizes the responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession alongside enslavement that generated the wealth reflected in this historic house and museum. Using collections, interpretation, programming, and through collaborative relationships, the Porter Phelps Huntington Museum is working to examine, address, and reflect on these difficult but necessary histories. This series, Bridging the Past and Present, is part of that process. It's supported by a Bridge Street grant from Mass Humanities, whose mission is to lead and support humanities programs to improve civic life in Massachusetts. Mass Humanities work is made possible by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Mass Cultural Council, and the generosity of their donors. This summer, the Porter Phelps Huntington Museum has remained closed for tours and on-site programming, but the National Scenic Byway Trail system that begins at the museum is open for hikers and will be all through the beautiful fall. And while the house itself is closed to visitors, the museum's wonderful group of summer interns have been busily engaged all summer in an array of preservation and reinterpretation projects, so as to be ready to tell more and different stories when we reopen next summer. And indeed, I'll say, already making so many fascinating new bits of information about the family and the house and the place and history available on the museum blog. For now, we're delighted to be able to offer these bridging presentations about the history of this place and the many generations of diverse people who lived and worked here. So we hope to see you in person in 2022. I'm Karen Sanchez-Epler, teach American Studies and English at Amherst College, and I'm newly president of the board of the Porter Phelps Huntington Foundation. If you appreciate this place and the work we're striving to do and enjoy today's free programming, we hope you'll use the donation button on the Porter Phelps Huntington website to make a donation in support of the museum. It's now my enormous pleasure to introduce Ben Mutschler and Robert Gross. Ben Mutschler earned his PhD in history from Columbia University and is associate professor of history at Oregon State University, where he teaches courses on early America. We're gathered today to celebrate his first book, The Province of Affliction, Illness and the Making of Early New England, published in 2020 by the University of Chicago Press. He's currently undertaking a new book project that explores the ways in which discussions of citizenship in the era of the American Revolution and the capacities demanded of citizens in a republic engaged questions of ability and disability. The structure of our program today will be a conversation between Ben and the eminent social and cultural historian of early New England, Robert A. Gross. Bob hired me decades ago when he was professor of American Studies and History at Amherst College, but he left to chair the American Studies program at William and Mary and then moved back to New England as the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Professor of Early American History. So good to have women's names in honorary chairs at the University of Connecticut, now emeritus. His first book, The Minutemen and Their World, published in 1976, received the Bancroft Prize for 1977, and it was reissued in a 25th anniversary edition in 2001, and will appear in a new revised edition in 2022 to mark the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. His latest book, The Transcendentalists and Their World, continues his exploration of Concord, Massachusetts in an era of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. And it will come out from Farrar, Straus and Giroux in November of this year. Robert and Ben, the screen is yours. Thank you so much for agreeing to participate in this program. We're really delighted to be hosting this conversation.
Thank you, Karen. You make me want to be back in the Connecticut River Valley right away. Wondered why I ever left, and left the opportunity to work with you, but here we are.
And almost you are very back in Massachusetts, which is a good thing, as we can see.
So I'm also really pleased to be here to have the opportunity to call attention to Ben Mutschler's book, The Province of Affliction, and to tell everybody who's out there, either now, today, in this Zoom call, or in the future on the Porter Phelps Huntington House website, why this book is so important and why you should race out to get it and see your understanding of early American history and of the present transformed by what he's done. I first encountered Ben's work back in 1999 when he applied for a postdoctoral fellowship at the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture at the College of William and Mary. I was then a member of the staff and one of the readers of the submission, and the applicants had to supply either chapters of their dissertation or the entire thing. My recollection is that Ben submitted the entire dissertation. And I was immediately blown away by the literary grace, the analytical force, and by the historiographical significance of his work. But what got me most of all was that he offered us something profoundly original, and that is a far-reaching examination of everyday life in New England that allows us to see communities in new ways. A lot of historians say in politics, look at the past from the perspective of the courtroom and the legislative assembly and the lobby and the executive office, or maybe crowds in the streets and mass demonstrations. Economic historians look at history from the farm and the counting house and the factory. Ben does something radically different. He has us view society from the sickbed. And from that perspective, we can see how life and community are constructed through measures to assist individuals suffering from disease and to help out families struggling to cope with the pressures that their ailing members put on their abilities to stay afloat. Well, this is really a universal problem that every society, past and present, has had to deal with. And so Ben's work has much wider significance beyond the field of early America. As, in effect, as he says, sickness and distress create community. And I would add, except when they don't. Because at the same time, the public, as the Province of Affliction tells us a story of such broad import, the book also could not be more timely. Because here's a study that shows us families struggling to care for their ailing loved ones and to keep themselves together. It shows us employers providing health care for workers until the costs become too exorbitant. It shows us governments determined to cut back on skyrocketing medical costs. And it brings to view populations under quarantine by local governments in order to stop the spread of epidemic disease. But some people we see flout the rules in the name of liberty. At a moment when we're still living with the pandemic of coronavirus, with challenges to mask mandates and vaccination passports, the Province of Affliction presents our forerunners in the 18th and early 19th centuries, responding to medical emergencies in ways that once very different from, and yet also anticipating our own. As former Vice President Hubert Humphrey remarked in 1977, the moral test of government is how that government treats those who are in the dawn of life, that is, the children. How it treats those in the twilight of life, the elderly, and how it treats those who are in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped. Well, we can look at early New England with Humphrey's view in mind and Ben's broad-ranging conceptualization of health, sickness, medicine, and community. And we can do that, obviously, looking at our own society as the point of comparison. I think one of the interesting things about our conversation that we're now going to have is, what will our appraisal be? Do we flunk the test of early America? Does it set standards for us? Or is it simply nostalgia to think that early New England gives us a template? So let me simply begin by asking you, Ben, to maybe tell us how you came to this subject and developed such a fresh approach.
First of all, Bob, thanks so much for that wonderful introduction. You have from the outset been such a supporter of the work and able to frame it in large and exciting ways, and you continue to do that. So I appreciate that. I'm delighted to be here with you. And thanks to the Porter Phelps Huntington Foundation and Susan Lisk for arranging this, and for Karen Sanchez-Epler for moderating and holding us all together. I see that we are a intimate group here, although virtually intimate, and I'm hoping that folks will have questions as we go along and can type them in. I really welcome those, and I'm happy to proceed in whatever way seems most useful to everybody here and suggestive. So the question of how I got into it, Bob and I were talking a little bit ahead of time, and he prompted me to consider something that I really don't talk about very much at all, which was there a personal interest here? Was there something in my family background? And he was, in a typical kind of detective way, as historians do, interrogating a bit. And indeed, he came up with something, which is, I grew up, my dad was a psychiatrist. He actually worked in Concord. Bob, I didn't tell you that, at Emerson Hospital for many years. And there was a lot of, elsewhere in the family, social work loomed large. My mom was a social worker and then eventually went back and got her PhD in the economics of aging and ran a center on women and aging. And I don't know if it's Oedipal or not, but I don't discuss madness in the book particularly. Some of this has to do with, I was trying to look for ways to circumscribe an already kind of sprawling project. But maybe there's something there. The son turns away from the father. But the social welfare aspect to it, I think, really is quite central to the work. Because if I'm asking, a question about the society, a central one is, who's responsible for illness and how do folks figure that out? And while I think there's much that's commendable about this earlier society, we can talk about it later. I try hard to sketch out the conflicts over that problem, over the responsibility of illness. There's a lot of struggle, and in the end, illness winds up defining and testing the boundaries between the fundamental building blocks of this period: family and household, the distinction between the two, province, state, finally the federal government, all of whom are wrestling with this problem that continues with us today. So that's the sort of personal history. Let's see.
Ben, you mentioned on the phone that when we talked the other day, that also your mother's a social worker and lots of others in your family are social workers?
Yes, yeah. Here, let me, I'm sorry, this is a little Zoom moment. I'm going to hang up. I'm in my office, which I have not been in really for much of the last year and a half, but the internet is stronger here. And there's occasionally little sounds that will emerge. Sorry for that. That was just my phone ringing. I've unhooked it. Yeah, there was social work in the family, actually several generations. So that's come by all the interest in this, honestly, I suppose. But you know, the other way that that attracted me to the project was going back to graduate school in a seminar with Richard Bushman. And I'll say that, you know, this project has taken a long time to emerge in print. I'm very grateful for that. And my life has taken many twists and turns, including a long stint in administration. So I'm delighted that I had the chance to have this be in front of all of you. That seminar asked us each week to look at a different sort of chunk of materials. You know, one week it would be the Diary of Elizabeth Drinker and a full year of that. Another would be correspondence. Another would be court records and governmental records and newspapers and so forth. And the idea was to build out from those, see within those documents what kinds of values were embedded in them, to see if we could sort of build a portrait of society, politics, and culture that came from within the documents themselves. And the idea was that, you know, some historical research proceeds by starting with the topic at hand. You know what you want to find, you go find it. And maybe there's a lot about it out there, maybe there's a little, and sort of a needle in the haystack kind of thing. But another approach is to begin with the sources and say, what are the problems embedded in them, and work outwards. And that's how I came up with this. Because each week in that seminar, we encountered people talking about being unwell. Often just sort of little punctuated comments. It wasn't clear what ailed them. You didn't, you know, in some ways one might read through these to try to get to the real story at the time, right? What's really going on here? Because it's just sort of this punctuation of everyday life with these records of people feeling ill. But for me, what intrigued me about that was that they were first seeing it and talking about it. It was visible to them, and it seemed worth comment. And you know, there are a lot of different ways to approach that topic. There's a long history of people interested in what we might think about when we think about the early modern world and illness, which is death, right? And the connection between sickness and death. And so there's a lot of demographic historians who had worked on that. And indeed, that's a huge problem. Laurel Ulrich finds that out of every 24 births, there would be an infant death. About half the deaths in New England were of children under age 11. Maybe 10 to 30% of children died within the first 5 years. You know, it depends on where you're looking and so forth, but high mortality rates just for children. And yet the overwhelming experience for people in the period was to get sick and to survive it. And so the question then is, what were the stakes? What were the social stakes? What were the stakes in terms of government for that? That became my sort of query. And
could we say that what you did was that sickness, disease, death, most of the time in the early modern world, they're background. And you moved them to foreground.
I tried to say, what would a portrait of society, politics, and culture look like with illness at the center, rather than it's something being peripheral? Because if you look at the records at the time, it's there in all sorts of places. And the intriguing thing about that language, as vague as it is about what ails people, we mostly don't know. Even if the words that they use meant the same thing today as it meant at in the earlier period, and we could talk about that. Historians of medicine have shown that diseases and their meaning change over time, even if the word is the same. But it's a social language. What do they say when they're sick? Somebody might say they're indisposed, right? Implying that which they can't do, or they are laying by, or you might describe children as being tendful. All of these implicate others in an orbit, such that we think, I try to suggest that each illness creates its own kind of society. It implicates a lot of people around the ill. And the question is, who forms there, at what cost? And in particular in New England, which is considered one of the healthiest places in the Western world, what is the combination of things, of muscle and motion and movement, as we expect of good industrious New Englanders, and the world of illness, which is what? People walking around for a while, muscle, movement, motion, and then they drop out and they bring others with them. And what is that world? It's of absence and delay and excuse and the need for accommodation. And so it's the interplay between those two, the world of health and the world of illness, that interests me most profoundly.
So were there books in the history of medicine that had dealt with this before? Are there interpretations in the scholarship that you felt you had to contend with? My own impression is that history of medicine has tended to take the study of specific diseases as the point of focus, not the study of the peoples and societies with the diseases.
Mm-hmm. There's it's an enormous field and subfields within this. Yes, there are sort of biographies of different diseases, and we have those from the past, say on smallpox or yellow fever or tuberculosis and this kind of thing, and cholera, and those will continue. And indeed, I saw the latest round of NEH funding is funding some projects just like this. Not surprisingly, a kind of renewed interest in infectious disease from the early modern period. And in terms of healing, there was an early sort of work on therapeutics and doctors, physicians, and then expanded that out to a rich social history of healing. But what interests me was less the problem of sort of, well, they were sick, how did they heal? Which is talked about certainly in the records, but not as dominant as just this ongoing record of people being ill. And so for me, it became much more a question of the social relations of illness and the stakes of illness for those societies.
So could you illustrate that maybe by taking the Porters and the Phelpses and Hadley and maybe Reverend Ebenezer Hartman of Westborough, Massachusetts, and tell us something about how their diaries allowed you to develop your point of view on what families did, households did when they had sick members.
I used several diaries, including the very rich diary of Elizabeth Porter Phelps. And I'm grateful to Susan List to have been able to do that. And I lean even more heavily, I would say much more so, on Ebenezer Parkman, and a thanks there to Ross Beals. When I had a short-term fellowship at the American Antiquarian Society, and Beals had transcribed painstakingly the entirety of that massive diary, which runs from 1724 to 1782. And it's with those transcriptions that I was able to query, these little fragmentary references to people being ill to try to create sort of biographies of individuals. In Parkman's family, there's 16 children through 2 marriages, Mary Champney and Hannah Breck Parkman. So, and then Elizabeth Porter Phelps is important as well, of course, in the work, along with the third diarist I look at most consistently. Whoops, I'll come back to that in a moment. I'm having a blanking, Ashley Bowen, excuse me, from Marblehead. It's sort of early, late afternoon, nap time here. Okay, so where do you find this? In brief mentions, generally, just a simple record of so-and-so is sick, maybe some kind of line accompanying this. And maybe I could do is in the first chapter, after the introduction of the book, I tried to do something to try to bring everything together before I looked at individual aspects, say a chapter on family or household relations or town governance and so forth. And what I do is I take a single day in which these different diarists, and there's town records I look at too, are dealing with sickness. And in a sense, it's just random. It's a chance to look from these different vantage points of what's happening in that day. So on that day, this is October 18th, 1769, we find, for example, a young Elizabeth Porter, age 21, accompanied by Silence Bartlett, who was active as a tailor at 40 Acres. And the two seem to have had a relationship over time. Silence would come and stay for periods of time. And they occasionally, we can find them doing social activities together, such as berrying. And the entry that that I focus on for that day has Elizabeth Porter saying, tea at Kellogg's, one of the leading families in town in Hadley, and then watched with Silent Bartlett at night with Widow Smith. And that's it. About there's other things described, people coming and going, and the rest, that's all that there is to that short entry. And what I do is try to build out from that and say, well, what was this business of watching? And what does it tell us about this society? And how might we think about the different things at stake for Silence Bartlett versus Elizabeth Porter? She'd marry the next year and become Elizabeth Porter Phelps. So watching, for many of you here, you probably know about this, is a New England custom and celebrated in the 19th century as the best the community had to offer in the earlier period, even as 19th century folk could be very critical of the earlier period. Requires people to stay the night, offering comfort in whatever way they could, staying up. Occasionally people would apply different kinds of therapeutic devices, but more often reading from the Bible or other tracts and simply staying with their neighbors. And it's a remarkable kind of thing to trace. In Parkman's case, I've got a chapter, I try to see how resilient that is. And basically after about 2 weeks, it becomes difficult to recruit people, even for a prominent person like Parkman. You just can't keep getting 2 people night after night to come. In the case of watching with Widow Smith, the 2 show up and they watch the night, and we don't know much other than, as I've said, the kinds of things people do when they watch. But I try to think about the relation between Bartlett and Elizabeth Porter. Here they are joined together in this community endeavor to watch through the night. And yet, if we think about tea at Kellogg's and the representation of gentility that comes along with that, Porter being one of the prominent families in town, one of these river gods, that kind of sociability is something that Bartlett is not part of. She's not in that circle of refinement with Elizabeth Porter. And yet they're joined together around this economy of affliction. And so they watch together. And afterwards, I was just going to say, afterwards, you have to imagine Porter going back to 40 Acres, but it's a night of staying up and all that means. I suppose we all know what that might feel like. But Bartlett has to get back to work, paid work for her in order to continue her life. And so the outcomes of this are different as well.
But we could add something else, which is that Elizabeth Porter, from daughter of one of the most prominent families in the area, who's about to make a very, very good marriage, is spending the night watching Mrs. Smith with a craftswoman.
That's right.
So the sickness and the need of care cuts across class boundaries. It's also one in which 2 single women are engaged in an activity together. So that's right. You've got, now, how often do you ever find men and women spending the night together watching?
No, I do find men, and including Daniel Worthington, who manages the farm for a period of years at the Phelps, at the estate. Men would do this, but much less often than women. As you say, it's often single women, the elder daughters of families that would go out. And I think about this in part as a way of creating community. Um, Ebenezer Parkman has several older daughters that, as one of the things they do as they get into their teens, is learn how to go watch, and they're sent out. And then Parkman's able to call in those favors, in effect, a kind of social economy, a credit economy, without it being registered particularly in any account book. But in the diary, we see who is sent out, and then those families return the favor. It's not, Bob, as you said, it joins single women across class lines, but of course, class matters there too. And gender matters as well. Men are not asked to do this as much as women are, and there's a sacrifice of these families to send their daughters out to do
Right.
this.
So there's a lot, what you're describing in the book is an immense amount of social labor that sustains households in all kinds of ways. We know more broadly, farmers will exchange with their neighbors. Maybe you own a team of oxen and I got a plow, and we do each other's work when we need to. Women engage in quilting together. There's all kinds of social labor that knits the fabric of community, and in many ways across class boundaries. And
Yeah.
so, and this is, as you say, with dealing with sickness, it's often silent labor. It doesn't show up a lot in records unless you're looking for it. So if it suddenly hits me, one of the great questions in American history is always, why isn't there more class struggle? Why wasn't there, class warfare, social class warfare? Well, maybe because all kinds of ties are being built in the intimacies of everyday life that the labor historian looking for class conflict doesn't know are there.
Yeah.
And yet, who sits up with a slave in illness? Who watches and cares then? Can you talk about that?
I write a bit about Phyllis, and there are many Phyllises who are enslaved in Hadley, and many that are mentioned, sometimes difficult to figure out who's who in the diary. But the third generation of enslaved people at 40 Acres has a young child named Phyllis, who is the daughter of Rose, who's the daughter of Peg. And Phyllis, the younger, from a very early age, Elizabeth Porter Phelps notes, is somebody that appears to be sickly. And it seems that there's probably swellings of various sorts that concern them. Initially, they worry about whether she has rickets, and they take her to a variety of healers around that. Later, they think that she may have the king's evil, which is today we would refer to as scrofula. Again, various symptoms, including large swellings in the nodes. And they take her to a seventh son. A seventh son of a seventh son was supposed to be able, through touch, to heal somebody with the king's evil. I'm struck there in the care for Phyllis about just how much labor they put in, and backed by finances, for caring for the enslaved. And yet, it's not, while there's a few mentions of Elizabeth Porter Phelps caring for Phyllis, they also wind up bringing in the grandmother, Peg, finally, in her last days. Phyllis's mother dies 2 years before Phyllis after long struggles herself. And it's necessary to bring in other people for Phelps to continue on in her role as this matriarch of this large production that she is in charge of. And so they lean on others to do that as well.
What if I said, in a cynical way, that it was in their interest to maintain their property value? They already spent a lot of money acquiring enslaved people.
Yeah.
And you sure don't want to lose that, so you'll spend the money to keep her alive and working.
The paradox of slavery is that one is both person and property, right? And I suppose these things, we can see them both. We don't have to disaggregate them in that way. One can be personally attached to someone that is also going to be a laborer, and it's something that is an investment. I mean, as difficult as that is for us to wrap our minds around, I think that's very much in the mind of Elizabeth Porter Phelps, who laments this death. I try to write about this, showing that, it's at once there's care, and yet there's something quite brutal, Bob, that you're alluding to, which is, even in referring to this in refined ways and referring to this as a matter of piety, in turning to Jesus and the sense of looking at the own state of her soul in the wake of this child's death, yet and still, she's owned this other human being. And it's all sort of covered with this other language, but that fundamental relation remains there. So yeah, I think you're right to point to that it could be both of these things married
Let me just
together.
point to one other moment in your account. So if you're a white apprentice and you've been bound out to a master, and the master's agreed, he's going to enable you to learn to read and write, and he's going to take care of you in sickness and in health. It turns out, if you're really sick, how much did they really mean it?
Yeah. So I tried in chapter on household labor, which includes a discussion of the sort of what's at stake when the enslaved become sick, and I've got that section on Phyllis there. I look also at indentures of various sorts. Charles Phelps has a very interesting one, where there's a discussion of things that can be provided reasonably, food and physic and nursing, for example, but then he offers a special bonus if a servant will be as healthy as servants are supposed to be. That is, there's an anticipation of somebody that may not be well and an incentive to try to have them continue to labor through their malaise. What happens with many of these indentured contracts is that the master is supposed to provide in all these ways, including medical efforts to help out the sick. But the problem is that relation is tied to the successful performance of tasks. And what happens when people are sick? They can't labor effectively. It's not something that happens suddenly or clearly. They're sort of not going at full speed, then they're finally down and out. And you see masters of all sorts bemoan this kind of thing. And then it begs the question of who's responsible. Is the master, having taken on an apprentice of whatever sort, responsible there, as the indenture might seem to have us believe? Or has the servant in some ways fallen down on their duty by no longer being able to perform? And what I find in the book is that over time, there's initially the care for these servants of various sorts, but eventually their families of origin or others responsible for them are leaned on, and they have to come and fetch these people. Sometimes this winds up being adjudicated in court, and I talk about that a bit as well. It's an ambiguous world that is called into being by people not being in full health, right?
Well, I was so struck by something that is a bit of an exaggeration as an analogy, but you're describing a world where you get, you're bound out as an apprentice or as an indentured servant, and hey, one of the benefits is employer provided health care. Except when the costs mount, the employers are thinking, how do we cut the costs here? We can't afford it. Cut him loose, send him back to his parents, send him back to their family. And if your family's too poor, this takes us to the next part of your book. Well, let the town pay for him.
That's right. That's
And
right.
you tell a really interesting story, and you can elaborate on this, of how New England towns actually pay the bill. And the poorer you are, actually, the more you can get the town or the colony to pay the bill.
Yeah.
You don't want to be, I came away from your book like, I don't want to be middling in this world. I want to be rich because I can take care of things, or I want to be poor because the town will take care of me. Otherwise, I'm going to be like all the middle-class people in America today, suffering and staggering under healthcare costs.
You put that provocatively, and I tend to be a kind of a mediator sort of person. So let me smooth that over just a bit, Bob. But I think you're because do you want to be poor? Well, it's certainly not desirable to be on the rolls of as a dependent. And as 19th century historians comment, that earlier world of poor relief had its cruelties, including most notoriously that towns would award often care to the lowest bidder. And so there's that issue. But I came to think about this more along the way that you're talking about it. Initially, when initial drafts of this book was very harsh on these towns and their sort of spare provision. But then I came to think about, well, on the other hand, it's an elegant system that anticipates that everybody needs a place of care. And in Massachusetts, they do this quite unusual thing. First, there's the elegant way in which poor law is constructed, which is that everybody has a home base, a town that they acquire residency in. The town's responsible through the issuing of taxes, and you pay out of the coffers. And this also can help other poor people who are caring for the poor themselves. So it becomes a kind of by employment for them.
And can I just add,
Yeah.
lots of people today think the federal government or state governments should pay people to stay at home to take care of ailing loved ones. And especially the burden in the 18th century and today still falls heavily on women.
Yeah.
Especially in the pandemic, who had to leave the job market to take care of things. So
That's right.
we're talking about something similar.
Yeah, that's
And
true.
I'm going to break in just because one of the things we've been doing this summer is participating in the Pioneer Valley History Network's documenting early Black life in the Connecticut River Valley project, which has been a kind of historians barn raising activity where everybody who wants to goes to any historical society and just starts working their way through things, looking for records. And I've been going through the Overseer of the Poor's records in Hadley this past month, and seen so many moving examples of the free Black population in Hadley taking in other members of the African-American community who are unwell, as well as, what Bob was just saying about, instances of deaths where, where the town as a whole spent quite a bit of money in support and time. But that sense of, just really moving instances of long-term commitments from inside the Black community to take care of each other, and using the overseer structure to get some compensation for that.
Mm-hmm. And Marla Miller writes about this as well, right? That there are sort of sub-communities that are forming around that become these caregiving networks. And, again, it's something that can be both about warm social relations, about community, at least, one that asks of sacrifice for everybody, but also something that comes with some remuneration, right? I mean, that all these things fold together. We might think about that if you're getting paid well, that's all about the market. But I think there's a different sensibility in the period. All these things can be blended together. Interesting, Karen, I'll ask you a question. Did you come across any state pauper accounts? Because I should tell folks about that. It's a major wrinkle in Massachusetts, and I trace this as something that finally has sort of results that lead to other kinds of ways of conceiving of the public provision for the ill.
So this is really so far just being item, I guess it's a kind of atomized gathering. I mean, I really do have a barn raising feeling of like, how many people can fit socially distanced and masked in the Hadley Historical Society, and what or the Forbes or Northampton Historical or the Jones or whatever, like we're Greenfield, Hatfield, but also, so I did see lots of records of towns paying each other.
Well, so
and I saw one or two places where it seemed like there had been money that had come into the overseers from the state.
Right.
But
so let me just quickly, because I want to move on. The colony, Massachusetts, and then the state had a provision that if you didn't have a home base, if you couldn't go to one town and said, you owe me, you got to take care of me, then the bill would be picked up by the state or provincial government.
That's
And
right.
Nina Dayton and Sharon Selinger show that this was an astonishingly progressive social welfare policy that enabled people to move from place to place while giving them a safety net.
Yeah,
What we really been
I talk about
describing
this.
here,
Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say, what we've been describing really is how a safety net is made
Mhm.
from families and households to town governments and the province. And I want to switch this because people would be really disappointed if we don't then talk about epidemics, pandemics, quarantines, and smallpox.
Yeah.
So,
Bob, let me
yeah.
just take 2 minutes on to just add a couple of things, then we can get into that if that's okay. What Dayton and Salinger find, especially as with Boston, is these province poor accounts. And just as you said, the theory that says that everybody should belong somewhere has a corollary to it, which is that if you belong nowhere, somebody has to pick this up. Why is that? Because people aren't allowing persons to be dreadfully ill in their presence and just ignoring them. And so the costs accumulate quickly, and the process of sorting that out takes a very long time. Where you found towns writing one to another, that's because you can fall sick in a town that you don't belong to. That town then acquires all this debt and supporting you, and then they go after the town of origin. Then it turns out that that town sometimes says, oh no, that the person doesn't belong to us, they belong elsewhere. And so there's a struggle that goes on. These schedules don't match. Sickness is immediate and requires in people's extremity some kind of care. And the costs and the ways that reimbursement gets figured out often takes a long time. The state poor accounts that emerge from these province accounts for people that don't belong anywhere really get going in the wake of the American Revolution. And I have a whole chapter on that. And what's important, and Karen, maybe this is something to look for in the mass acts and resolves, is that town after town throughout Massachusetts are petitioning the state to get payment for state paupers. Some suspect that even towns are saying people don't belong so that they can get that money, as opposed to them being part of the town. And I trace this, even though there's not great sentiment about the poor in the wake of the revolution, about African Americans in Massachusetts, who after all are subject to vagrancy laws and all sorts of other punishment, that the reason that those continue to grow is because there's no other place to turn for reimbursement for these, especially long-term illness. And there's a lot of debility, people that are there for a year or more on these pauper rolls. Not large numbers of people, but many of them are African American, there's Native Americans, and then people that are from different countries that have come in. Anyway, so that's part of that story, just for your future barn raising folks. All right, Bob, I'm ready. We're ready for epidemics.
I was just going to say, in the social changes of the 18th century, young men looking for land because they can't stay on the small farm their fathers can provide them, and then the Revolution and War, shuffle up the population, send everybody along the roads, and make a world where now state government's going to have to pay for a lot more people than it ever did.
That's right.
And you show in the book that state legislators in Massachusetts, true to form, want to cut the spending on the poor and want to cut the spending on social welfare. And they find ways to do it.
Yeah.
But so pandemics do something else, which is you've described a whole world of people being in families and households and being taken care of. And sickness is part of everyday life. But smallpox separates people from the community. It makes them, takes familiars and makes them strangers who have to live in pest houses, in their own houses or a pest house, with a red flag in front and a guard keeping you from going in, and the roads posting signs saying, don't go this way, take a detour, smallpox here.
That's right.
And towns did this robustly, you show.
Yes.
How often did people break the rules? Or did they say, Someday we're going to fight an American Revolution so that we don't have to be subordinated to the demands of community. Someday we will know that King George is as unacceptable as a mask mandate.
Yeah.
So
The-
what was it like to try
Yeah.
to impose a quarantine?
There's a long history of quarantine in Massachusetts, which is at the kind of vanguard of this public health provision, both initially blocking ships that would come in that needed to be inspected, and then also tracking people that would come into towns. And there's regulations that are elaborated over the course of the 18th century around that. And you've talked about some of them, the sick needing to identify themselves, or others telling the selectmen very quickly a public health apparatus put in place, which would be to sequester people in their houses, guards put up and so forth, identify, or they'd be sent to a pest house of some sort. And when we think about the coercive powers of the state, and here I think of Barry Levy's phrase, the town state, the immense power that these towns have for much of this period is really on full display. And you might think that there would be all sorts of resistance to this, major resistance. If you can imagine today, the state showing up and saying, you would now be stuck in your house with others with infectious disease, regardless of your status, and you're going to remain there for a month. Just think about the struggles we're having over, civil liberties issues and rights and so forth. And you could imagine in an era of revolution, this might cause all sorts of unrest. But in fact, in general, that's not the case. Yes, there are little pushbacks of all sorts. People that don't want to move from their house to the pest house, so they're allowed to stay in their house. People that try to have visitors and have to be rebuffed. Occasionally elite people that get exemptions to the rules. But on the whole, in terms of the public health provision, these coercive measures done in the name of community are adhered to. And I think that the overall sense is that's what it means to be part of community. That's the kind of sacrifice, as John Winthrop says, is being part of a community of perils, knit together through shared suffering that can only be handled collectively. If everybody goes and does their individual thing, things are going to fall apart. Now, there's one exception to this, which is inoculation, the intentional infection of somebody with a lesser case, hopefully of smallpox, by taking scabs or pustules and inserting that into an incision in the arm or leg. There are riots that develop, including in a place that I look at. I look at an outbreak in Marblehead in 1773. There's a riot in 74 where they burned down an inoculation hospital. And what happens there is people start to feel like the community is not being served by inoculation. It's too expensive. Not everybody can get it. People are breaking the rules. It turns out that you're infectious when you are inoculated, and you may feel fine. And then if you walk about in the community, you may infect others. So there's a lot of trepidation about that unless you can get everybody inoculated.
And just think if
yeah.
they'd known that Africans could have gotten credit for introducing inoculation.
Say again?
And just think if they'd known that Africans could get credit for introducing inoculation.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Cotton Mather in 1721, as he's advocating for inoculation in Boston during this very controversial period, is drawing on one of his enslaved workers, Onesimus, who's granted to him by the church, his church. And it's African folk knowledge that he's drawing on there, in addition to reading learned treatises in the Philosophical Transactions. And together, Mather uses both of those sources from his enslaved worker and from this transatlantic literary culture to make a case for inoculation. Some people argue against inoculation early on, thinking that, in fact, enslaved people may be having this as a big hoax, and that if you get inoculated, you're a fool because enslaved people may be trying to kill their masters. But eventually numbers on this win out, and people start to count scrupulously, and the case fatality rates are much less with inoculations, although not zero, maybe 2%.
Right, but your language of hoax and fool remind me of certain public officials who would use just that for such an innovation. I have one other question for you, then maybe we can open it up for our small group, but I want to be sure to pose it. Okay, so you've described a world of community, of all kinds of interconnections between households and families and local governments and province government, that with all the inequities that are there, still hangs together to deal with sickness and distress. So was the American Revolution a good thing or a bad thing for the sickly?
Yeah, it's a great question. It fuels a lot of new need, especially by people that become sick during the war. Their families are responsible for them. It's expeditionary warfare. They're left on the frontier, northern theaters, for example. Their family has to go get them. It's enormously costly. The medical bills pile in. And we see petition after petition coming to the Massachusetts General Court from families asking for compensation for sick soldiers, for example. And then, of course, there are pensions for disabled soldiers, disability pensions, which have a long precedent in the colonial period and continue on. So there's a lot of costs that get generated in the war. But in terms of the ideology itself, if you think about independence, right, just the Declaration of Independence, but personal independence as well, as distinct from a world of dependence, of interdependent relations between superiors and subordinates. Here, in the wake of the revolution, more and more is asked of the sick. They're asked to tend to themselves, to be responsible for themselves. The question might be posed, if you are sick and impoverished, and those two things often go together, the fear of being brought into abject poverty through long illness, the question that begins to be asked is, well, why didn't you save for a rainy day? And what kinds of habits have you taken on that might make you sick? And the government itself starts to lean more heavily on the sick to say, this really should be something that's a bit of your own problem, as opposed to the problem of, along the lines of monarchy, a protective government that helps out those beneath them. And so I think the revolution has to be seen as something that actually is deleterious for the public provision for the sick, especially the sick poor.
And you show in the book that a key force driving this is a desire of a public official to cut the budget. We don't want, and which is a response to taxpayers saying we don't want to pay a lot in taxes.
That's right.
And so the budget cutters are cutting away at this elaborate safety net that you've described in the first 2/3 of your book. You should have been really furious at them. You spent so much time describing the creation of a world that connects people, and then they destroy it. I mean, I expected outrage at the end of your book, but I want to just add one thing. You know, by the time of the Transcendentalists, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau are decrying the view of society as a mutual insurance company in which you live in such a way, you don't take risks, you do what community wants so that you can all be around. And if you ever fall in need, you can call in. And there are Emerson and Thoreau, whose families have suffered grievously from tuberculosis. Thoreau's going to die in 1862 at age 45 of tuberculosis. But nonetheless, you know, theirs is an ideology of liberty and health, not dependency and sickness.
That's right.
And it's just so striking that with no scientific grounding for the change in thinking, nonetheless, there's a dramatic alteration.
That's right. There's some changes in terms of thinking about sanitation, for example, that then can be linked to people in poorer circumstances and dirt and disease and so forth. But I think you're right on the whole. It's not a major medical shift. It's a different kind of shift. And I trace that to the revolution and the early national period. And then what emerges is in the voluntary society that comes, this is more handing off to you, Bob, in your world, in associations, we get things like voluntary groups to help the worthy sick poor. And so Massachusetts General Hospital, for example, emerges out of that. How to handle people that are away from family, that are trying to do the good thing that society is asking them to do, that are on their own. We can save them from poverty by having something like a hospital or charitable societies that are dedicated to the sick and the sick poor. But that means that the vast majority of people won't have access to that. So it's a very different kind of reconfiguration of the early national period.
And that distinction between the worthy poor who deserve a helping hand and the unworthy who don't takes us all the way through Ronald Reagan and down to the present.
It's a long theme going back to the Elizabethan Poor Laws.
Mm.
All right, I see we've been going on and on here. And Karen, I was so glad you could ask a question earlier. I'm hoping there'll be other questions if people can hang in there.
So there's one question here that asked whether you came across accounts of inoculation, variolation in Elizabeth Porter Phelps' diary.
Yes, I don't develop it, but it is there, including an account of a riot. And it's part of this larger constellation in the 1760s and 70s of people being really worried about inoculation unless everybody can get it. And the only way everybody can get it is if there's some sort of general inoculation sponsored by towns that will pay for the poor. Otherwise, it doesn't take hold and people get very upset.
So let me make a little, I know it's already 6 and I suspect that everybody else was as mesmerized by this conversation as I was. So just fine to have been listening to both of you, but want to make sure that if there are other questions people want to ask, that they have a moment to ask them.
We'd certainly welcome them from anybody.
Well, one thing we can say is that if the world of New England community in the 18th and early 19th century was bound by interdependence, where people saw each other and knew one another, however differentiated they were by class and status and gender and race, maybe we have created a simulacrum of interdependency on Zoom.
Uh-huh. Well, maybe that's a fit place to end. I don't know, Bob. I don't want to. It's for me. It's 3 o'clock. 6 o'clock, I know, is the dinner hour, and Zoom is pretty tough on folks. I
can see the martinis coming in the background of several of you.
For all of you, I really appreciate you coming out for this. It's nice to see you out there, and I'm happy if anybody wants to email me with any questions or anything to have an exchange.
And let me just say, it's a delight to have had the opportunity to read your work again and to read it closely in a way. I have to say, seeing Karen there in Amherst College, like I was preparing a seminar and thinking of the questions that would keep us going.
Bob, thank you so much for that.
Thank you both so much. It does feel so moving to ask these questions about vulnerability and about safety nets.
I think also I saw Barbara start speaking, so she might have a question.
Well, this would go off on some other total direction. So I was just trying to race through my brain to see if Native Americans were in the area and what of their tradition. You talked about African American traditions of medicine, and certainly Native Americans had a lot. So had they left things behind before they left the area, or what kinds of things were used at all in terms of medical treatment?
There's a lot of exchange, particularly early in the 18th century, therapeutic exchange with different physicians that are interested in native healing ways. And then, of course, there are native healers that are in these different towns. And through the 18th century, the book would be much stronger, I think, if I had more of that. I can't pretend that I have much on that, in part because I don't really talk about therapeutics in the book particularly. There's another theme, a sadder one, that I don't talk about very much or at length, but is talked about by people like Dan Mandel, which is to show over time the ways in which different Native groups, especially I'm looking at Massachusetts in my book most carefully, are steadily losing money and land because of various kinds of afflictions, including sickness. And we see this in their petitions to the general court. And the reason that they have to petition is that guardians are appointed for them. And in order to sell their land to pay medical bills, those petitions wind up in the general court. So there's a long and kind of difficult, wrenching story to read about that. And in some ways, those stories condense what happens in with many other different kinds of people, but it's so concentrated with these different native populations that's quite striking. And again, I'd recommend Daniel Mandel's first book, Beyond the Frontier, for that.
Thank you, Barbara. Well, it's 6:07. I just want to say thank you so much for this evening and everyone for coming. Have good dinners or afternoon strolls.
Yeah.
And Bob, come back.
Well, thank you. I was going to say to everybody, stay well. stay
That is
safe,
also right.
And observe the CDC guidelines.
Yeah, all right.
I agree with that.
Thank you.
And hopefully, Ben, you'll come east. and
I'd love
visit.
to. You know, I'm a New Englander.
I
I'm
didn't really know, but I'm
itching-
now learning.
Yeah, itching to get back home. I grew up in Lincoln.
Next
Okay.
country.
So, well, I'll hope to see you all in person at some point. And for now, thanks so much.
And
for
thank
coming
you.
out.
much.
Thank
so
you.
much.
Yep.
Appreciate
Okay.
it.
Bye-bye.